Thank you so much for the organizers for having me here, and thank you for finding this image from the exhibition upstairs last minute. I was really enchanted by it, and I wanted to have it. So rather than the visual or legal concept of violence, I would be thinking about violence in spatial terms. All social relations are fundamentally spatial. Violence is played out through interrelated sets of spatial relations among bodies, events, objects, images, and their publics. Space, place, and territory have been crucial components of white settler colonialism, oppressive and unjust immigration restrictions, regressive patriarchal society, and xenophobic empire preservation. Racial segregation on public transport, restriction of human mobility, state boundaries, security discourses and border anxiety, sovereign spaces and territories outside of the sovereign, projects of refugee containment, incarceration, and asylum, spatial planning of refugee camps are all examples of spatial regulations produced, maintained, and regulated by force and by threat. In this talk, however, I'm interested in the geographical mobility of violence, which frequently cuts across the discourse of territorial sovereignty, while words like state, place, territory, space, and country imply a degree of permanence and embeddedness. Violence can also unhinge these categories and reconstruct the historically and geographically delineated sites of aggression, carnage, death, loss, mourning, and anger, testing the limits of fundamental political categories like the cosmopolitan subject, citizenship, and human rights. My approach here is driven by the question of how the idea of space and distance in regard to violence can be conveyed, and how this idea helps develop a critical mode of analysis. And I also plan to bring the refugee pictures, since I'm a media scholar, and those processes of displacement, often forceful displacement, captured photographically, were very compelling to me. But after having seen the exhibition, I thought this is a perfect opportunity to actually talk about how violence takes place spatially. So Teresa Margolles' work considers the relationship between violence, space, and place as contingent upon the social, political, and economic context of death. In her work, depictions of violence are both embodied and spatially arranged. The first work of hers that I personally encountered at the Mexican Pavilion in 2009 Venice Biennial, titled De qué otra cosa podríamos hablar, what else could we talk about, is a series of interventions both inside the pavilion and outside it, along the streets and canals of Venice. One example of such intervention was the systematic mopping of the floor of the Mexican Pavilion, using water from the Mexican morgues. Mapping crime scenes from Mexico onto the Venice art landscape and bringing the visitor's body in more or less direct contact with the body of the victim, Margolles demonstrates how violence can be both geographically embedded and mobile. Traces of mortuaries, which, just like refugee camps, border zones, and lately more than ever airports, are liminal spaces in the legal and cultural imagination, are displaced here and available for gallery goers. They can be understood as a non-lieu or non-place, a place devoid of identity, perpetually temporary and extraterritorial, never a home, never a grave, never a final destination. A similarly complex relationship between violence and place is demonstrated in her work from time spent in Ciudad Juarez on the northern border of Mexico and the US, the city known as the City of the Dead Girls because of hundreds of young and adult women who have been murdered or have disappeared there. Earth and stones collected from the crime scenes have been carried abroad and displayed internationally as far as Switzerland. Margolles' art is concerned with both the materialization and the dematerialization of the event of violence, and with the physical, mental, and social spaces that constantly overlap and underpin each other. Although violence is a catastrophe that is time-based, gradually engulfing and affecting, photographs, by condensing intensity into a single moment, offer us a cut into the continuum of time. In the shadow of post-2001 surveillance regimes and the 2008 global economic crisis, network participatory media document and rely on systemic and physical violence. Therefore, thinking about space today requires thinking about media space. And this is also something I thought about when I looked at all those posters at the back, like how many of them are concerned about the coverage of tragic events or violent events. Media's relationship to space is a range of heterogeneous practices. Space is no longer a fixed, secure ontological thing rooted in the notions of authentic. Rather, it becomes an event, a process. It is reproduced and recreated. It is diffused and networked, created through and by media narratives, products, technologies, and practices, and operates across a multiplicity of international institutions. Today, the experience of distant or proximate violence consists of endless encounters as images travel across or sometimes overlapping sites, spaces, and screens. Visual technologies themselves have become more portable, allowing violence to occur in new sites and to transform these sites. Images circulate across national borders more freely than the bodies they capture. Next to professional journalists, for decades the chief context in which people encountered carnage, death, and loss, the increasing flow of citizen-created images has taken mainstream media reporting to a new stage, offering an unprecedented sense of proximity and imminence. Photographic representations of violence are exchanged on a scale unimaginable before. Their compactness and instantaneousness enable them to move rapidly across contexts and sites of encounter. A photo in a Kabul paramedic's Twitter post makes the front page of The Guardian. An embedded reporter's snapshot of a Syrian orphanage posted to Instagram becomes an exquisite and also expensive prize-winning print in a professional photography contest. A shot taken by a mobile phone in Abu Ghraib is turned into an oil painting by Fernando Botero. Shots by Mexican migrants representing their own experience of the hardships and perils of migration become a part of a humanitarian aid campaign. There is, however, always a price to pay for this unencumbered mobility. It is safe to say that visibility is a precondition for social recognition, for inducing feelings of responsibility in others, or for compelling distant others to care for a cause they would have previously remained unaware of. Digital imaging technologies have contributed to the increasing focus on reporting of violence by individuals and by oppressive regimes, occasionally managing to create responses of global outrage that have resulted in political pressure, including economic sanctions, the severing of diplomatic relations, and sometimes military intervention. The political meaning of such enhanced visibility is clear. Images of violence become the basis of discussion and can have material effects. And yet, the mobile, unattached visual articulation of violence in online spaces today, enhanced or dimmed by technology, possess not only affordances, but also limitations. Just like violence, technology expresses political values, although it is often presented as neutral. It depends on tacit knowledge practices, although it is often presented as transparent. It is material, although it is often presented as transcendent. And it involves embodiment, although it is often presented as disembodied. Practices of crowdsourced data labor, commercial software locative technologies, and target algorithms themselves determine the meaning and intensity of violence we get to witness. Last year, for example, an image of a different child, one that was clothed, featured prominently on Facebook. I'd say it in relation to the controversy about naked children lately in the humanitarian aid imagery. So the photograph of a drowned Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, which we've seen here, or we've seen the travestation of this photograph, lying face down in the sand on a Turkish island. While it traveled across timelines and profiles, it underwent a variety of aesthetic changes. It was cropped, made into a close-up, often oversaturated with color for more dramatic effect, accompanied by hashtags like humanity washed ashore. It was further used in photoshopped memes that removed the child's body from the original background and portrayed it against different backdrops. A child's bedroom, European Union quarters, paradise-like island. Props like angel wings, beach paraphernalia, or a baby crib have been edited in. Redone, redesigned, conscripted by its users, it became a piece of sentimental visual currency, a kitschy shrine, or a mournful allegory devoid of political significance. So I am, I think, less hopeful about the power of images than the previous panelists here. I feel like increasing visibility is not always the answer. And I appreciated the question about the Whitney Biennial and the writings of Hannah Black and Coco Fusco as well, who argue about what we do with the image, like how we disseminate it and how we like materially change it also impacts to what extent our spectatorship is accountable or not. The uncontested visibility of this and other images and the free fall of feelings they generate among global audiences spark ethical concerns about not only representing violence perpetrated by the refugee hostile system, but also violence perpetrated upon the image itself. Social media trading in the visual, fully aware of their power to emotionally trigger and mobilize its users, use proprietary algorithms that micro-target audiences with personalized content, moving images that are expected to generate emotional engagement to the top of feeds, and compressing the possible affective responses into short comments or the icons of a heart, a smiley face, or a sad face. The value of emotions as a sellable commodity in neoliberal corporate culture is undeniable and has been quantified and measured extensively. The US presidential election demonstrated more than ever that affect can act as a constellation of exchange within and between opposite political ideologies, more often than not generating emotional infrastructure that are bound to short circuit. So for me, I moved to US from the Netherlands a couple of months before the election. So this kind of emotional fallout of the election and how it unraveled in social media and how it marked the spaces and the places was unbelievable. Fuck your feelings, an unofficial slogan of the Trump campaign, visible on the t-shirts, banners, and bumper stickers of Trump supporters, acted to dismiss what the right wing reads as neoliberal sentimentality and soft political correctness, reaffirming hard feelings like pride or nationalism. Although seen as universal and floating freely, feelings and emotions conveyed by the images of victims of state-imposed and individual violence, of refugees, of the impoverished, press hard and geopolitically pinpoint communities in space. So I've been thinking lately about this relationship between mass violence and mass media as well. Like, what is this mass component in both of those words, both of those terms? Aware of the easy facility of graphic images in the representational economy of violence, and cautious of the easy temptation of tapping into emotions such as anger or compassion, Teresa Margolles often disputes the notion that a photograph is the only way to look at violence and look at the dead body. She denies us the immediate visibility of the aftermath of violence, instead substituting explicit images and words with a much more complicated experience that disables unrestricted access, indulgence, and consequently appropriation. In some of her works, violence is solidified and monumentified. I don't even know if this is a word, monumentified. A 6-meter wide concrete shelter planted in the corner of Echo Park near downtown Los Angeles called La Sombra is using the water that came from buckets taken by local artists to various homicide sites, where they rinse a section of a street and sponged up debris or residue. In others, however, violence becomes ephemeral. Her work Vaporization uses coolers to fill the gallery space with mist made from lavatio corporis, the water used in the mortuary to wash the corpses after autopsy. The gallery becomes a fog-bound space where visitors breathe in the mist. And the installation upstairs, the NOR, she places bubble-making machines used in dance clubs so that the bubbles generated float down onto gallery. Rather than a photograph or an object, the violence perpetrated upon long-gone bodies is being made present again through smell, humidity, through water touching our skin, seeping inside through the pores into our own body. Rather than a hard act, a physical gesture captured on film carrying force and weight, it is translated into the translucency and fragility of bubbles and mist, reminiscent of the seamlessness of a digital file traveling across media technologies. So it's also kind of frustrating for me that I'm telling you about my bodily experience in this installation, but I still am reduced to showing a photograph here. So I'm hoping you all had this experience as well. These practices make us realize that violence and its situation in space involve sensations rather than solely facts, objects, and images. They challenge the culturally inscribed hierarchy of senses, which has been at the heart of aesthetic theory, seeing vision as the absolute highest of all the senses, by turning to alternative sensory modalities, in this case touch, a proximal rather than distant sense. Also, they promote an often frightening collapse of distance between the viewer and the art object, fostering an immersive approach where the viewer is no longer only a viewer, but rather a subject of an embodied encounter. Violence here is palpable through temperature, touch, humidity, sound, orientation in space, forming a connective tissue. It is subject to cross-modal perception, to various forms of overlap between and leaps across the boundaries of clearly demarcated sensory channels. We experience it through immersion rather than representation or mediation. Rather than with the digital global mobility or geopolitical locationism, it is invested with sensory geography, linking institutionally defined social geography of place, such as countries, states, or territories, with experiential geographies where sensations circulate between human bodies. These tactile encounters with violence in the age of overwhelming compassion fatigue towards the endless stream of images have a chance of becoming a shareable portent of political and cultural attitudes, generating spatial infrastructures that either comply with patriarchy, racism, and xenophobia, or deploy sensations and feelings as a form of againstness, serving progress and social change. Violence and its displacement can be understood here as a generative intensity that can be used to disrupt dominant political discourses and inform alternate social imaginaries, bringing social change and granting possibilities for cohesion among post-conflict societies. So to conclude, long-traveled migratory routes, the formation of diaspora, urban protests, online mourning practices, these are all examples of how violence denotes contingent movements and linkages among humans that inform the affective practices of both anger and resistance and love and mourning. In reflecting on Teresa Margolles' practice, we witness the emergence of following questions: how to manage the remains of violence through its displacement, offering, next to testimony and forensic recognition, a compassion and accountability. Should violence remain intrinsically connected to the territories and sites in which it is perpetrated, or should it be all-saturating, moving freely across media technologies and electronic devices, revealing itself through photographs and words freely circulated by social media? How can we bring it to the awareness of global audiences without forgetting the bodies and places marked by it? Thank you.